We begin the current Daf, Mesech Yevamos Daf Memvav. We begin on the bottom of Memhem and Beis, 3 lines up in the bottom of the Amud, where the Gemara continues the related discussion for the previous Daf regarding the evidence of Yisrael. We talk about specifically that the way he becomes an Eved is with Milo, with circumcision, with Tvila, which we spoke about, and the mitzvahs like a woman. That's the primary thing we're going to be discussing regarding that of continuation of that idea about the Tvila. Shares co-sponsored by Kalzich and Cheskel Tanitim Daf Achem B'Shem Adjoining to today's Daf. So the things we discuss in today's Daf are that a guy who owns an Eved Kanani, he doesn't really own his guf, he only owns his peiros. A Jew who owns Eved Kanani owns his guf and he owns his peiros, and therefore there's going to be ramifications regarding the slave having some rights to free himself. Regarding, although the Geirus requires circumcision and immersion, what's the halacha if he is circumcised but doesn't immerse himself, or he immerses himself and doesn't circumcise? So the Gemara begins, bottom of Memhem Beis, 3 lines up at the bottom of the Amud. Someone purchases a slave from a non-Jew, and that's significant, that he's buying the slave from the non-Jew. And then the slave goes and he immerses himself, but when he does, although when the Jew buys him, he's supposed to immerse himself because that's when he becomes an Eved, Kanani, has certain halachas like a Jew, but he goes and he immerses himself for the purpose of being a free man. So the halacha is, and he acquires himself as a free man. Says what's the reason why he's becoming a free man? The Jew bought him from the non-Jew. Says the Gemara, a very important concept in ownership. As the Gemara contains a non-Jew does not acquire the body of the slave, of this slave initially. As the Gemara says later on, they are not able to own each other. So so whatever it is that he bought is what he's selling to the Jew. But he only had the kinyan of the peiros, didn't have any rights in the body of the slave. So who owns the slave himself? The slave did. His non-Jewish slave owner didn't own his body. So once he goes and he immerses himself for the purpose of being a free person, he removes the shibud, the servitude of the slave. That he removes when he immerses himself. Because like Rabbi says, a well-known halacha that's brought many times in Shas. Rabbi says, hektish. Let's say someone made his shiur into what's called a poitiki. A poitiki is from the word a poitehekoi, that this is where you're going to be able to collect, it's collateral. And then the person goes and takes that shiur that he made like collateral for someone to collect from, he was makdash to the mizbeach, which is a kedushas haguf, a physical sanctity in that ox. So that removes the shibud, the lien of the first person. Because as Rashi points out, kedushas b'dei gabayis would not remove it, as the Mishnah says in Eichan Avchov Gimel Beis. All you do is add on another dinner and you redeem those assets. But hektish haguf, that goes ahead and that removes the rights of the shibud. So to chametz, very appropriate for this Yom Tov. Let's say someone makes his cake into an apaitiki for a non-Jew, but it's in the domain of a Jew. And then it's 6 hours of Erev Pesach, midday on the 14th of Nisan. That now is Azman of Isra of Chametz. So that removes the shibud of the Eved Kachavim, because there's no substance by the non-Jew, and the Jew has to be mavar, because who owns the actual chametz? It's the Jew. And so to the shichur, let's say someone makes his slave into an apoitiki, the collateral to his friend, and then he frees the slave. He's freed, and that removes the money rights of the lender. All these 3 things of mafkim with a shibud, they move from the shibud, from the lien, and therefore the same thing is regarding geirus. When this non-Jewish slave goes and he tables for the purposes of being ben chayrin, that removes the shibud, because all the Jew bought was the rights to do work with him, but the ownership of the body, that no one owned. And then when he goes and he tables himself to be a free person, he is a free person, and the Jew cannot go ahead and treat him like a slave. Now, Master Rav Chizda asks that from the following brayso, Maisa bebeloya hagiyeris. So there's a story with Beloya the Giyeris, shekadmu abudeha v'tavlu fanaha. Her servants went and tabled before her, meaning she and her slaves were converting to Judaism. Before she went and before she became Jewish, her slaves went and went to the mikveh beforehand. The story came in front of the sage and they said, these slaves acquired themselves as free men. Now it sounds like that lefanel in, only because they went before her, because they were geirim and she was still not Jewish. Now, as we pointed out, importantly, that a non-Jew does not own the body of a Jew. Even a non-Jew doesn't own the body. So the moment they went to Taival, they freed themselves. Sounds like, but if they would have gone to the mikveh after she already immersed, then no, they wouldn't have been able to free themselves. Obviously, by Yisrael, we don't say that the Eved acquired himself as a free person. So that seems to contradict this opening halacha from Chama Goyim Erav that says that if the Jew bought the slave from a non-Jew and then he immersed himself, he could go ahead and make himself a free person. You see not. You see only because they went before her, but if they would have went after and she was already Jewish, they could not have freed themselves. So Merave says not a difficulty. Lefaneha, yes. Why did the Brisa stress that they went before her? Because that's bein b'stam. That's even unspecified. They didn't say we're traveling to be free people. A bein b'mefurish, whether they specified or didn't specify, the halacha is going to be that they can become automatically b'nei chayrin. But lachareha, but if they would have gone after her, meaning when they're Jewish, when the owner is already Jewish, that's been mefurish, and that's only when the slave specifies, I'm doing it to be a free person. B'stam loy, but unspecified no. Which that's like Rav Chaim Bakuria that said the person went and he tabled l'shem ben chayrin. When you have to do it explicitly to be ben chayrin is if the owner is Jewish, and that's what would have been had she tabled first. But beforehand, that would be we were saying even by stam, the person would automatically be considered as a free person.
If she tables first, she owns them as a yid then.
Right. So that's
so then
why,
even if they're mafurish, they can't.
No, that's the halacha that you said, well, it's cut in Shanaila. You want to know, meaning she owns them. Could a slave go ahead and title himself l'shem ben chayrin? What's her rights in the slave? Did she get? Meaning, does she have? I heard that's the shayla. Meaning, does she have? When the Jew buys the slave from the non-Jew, when do they have the opportunity of toiveling? Meaning, you have to first make a shibud. You have to make we're going to see in the Gemara shortly, when you buy, you have to make him into a slave. Shaila is here when she tabled, she became Jewish, but they didn't table yet. So up until then, when they table, they're not really fully her non-Jewish slaves, because they have to have a tefillah l'shem abdus. And if they could do it then, as they're doing that, they didn't become abodim yet, they could go ahead and make themselves b'nei chayr. Now the Gemara qualifies, some of the obvious says, Lo yishanu, didn't learn this halacha, ela b'lekeich man oibi kechavim. It's only if you're buying this slave who's a non-Jew from another non-Jew. As we said, that because no one had any rights in his body. But if a non-Jew himself is selling himself to the Jew, then Kani. Then the Yisrael acquires his body, and there in that case, if he goes and he tables himself l'shem b'chayrin, he would not acquire himself as a free person. Because the Siva says in the Pasuk in the Yikra, also with those of the dwellers that live with you, from them you could acquire slaves. What do you learn from this pasuk? From this pasuk you learn atem kain mehem. You could acquire from them, and they cannot acquire from you, and they cannot acquire each other. So the Gemara explains. When you're saying in the Brisa, that they cannot acquire from you. Lamai, what are you saying that the non-Jew cannot acquire the Jew as a slave? If you think to say it's referring to the handiwork, meaning for the labor of the Jew. Other if you think that a non-Jewish slave owner cannot acquire the handiwork, the actual labor of a Jew. But there's a pasuk over there, 2 psukim later, talks about selling as a slave. The pasuk there says that if let's say the ger and the toishav is going to become wealthy because they live amongst the Jewish people, and actually a fellow Jew is going to actually become poor, and he's going to be sold to the ger toishav with you, and the pasuk says oile eker, which is mishpachas ger. What does that mean? The master said when you talk about that a Jew is being sold to mishpachas ger, to the family of the ger, who's the family of the ger? So that's a non-Jew. Because the ger, he became a Jew. His family is non-Jewish. So you see that at least the ma'aseh yadayim of a Jew could be sold, or the Jew himself, his labor could be sold to a non-Jew, because the pasuk is talking about being sold to a non-Jew. El alav, rather, what do we mean here in the pasuk that the Brisa is telling us that the non-Jew cannot acquire the Jew? It means legufe, for the body of the Jew himself. Okay, so now explain the rest of the Brisa with that context. Kamrachman, the Torah is telling you, but atam koin mehem, you could acquire from them even the body of the non-Jew himself. So although before we said that if you didn't acquire his body, you only acquired his labor, and you only have him, let's say, after the tefillah, that's only when you're buying that non-Jew from another non-Jew. When you're buying the non-Jew straight from himself, where he has ownership over his body, you will acquire his body, and that's what we're saying, but a Jew will not be acquired by a non-Jewish slave owner of his body. But put Rav Acha asks on this halacha of Rav Avia, he says, but Ema maybe say, Bekaspo betfila. Maybe say it's with money and with tefillah for the purposes of abdus. That's where the Torah says that you're going to acquire the body of the non-Jew himself. But if let's say he goes and he tables himself to be a ben chayrin, maybe he would be a ben chayrin even when you're buying him from himself. So the Gemara Kashi, yes, that's difficult. Where does Rav Avia know that you see that you could buy the body of the slave and own the body of the slave? Who said that that's automatic? Why is it maybe? Who said maybe it's the same thing as when you're buying the slave from another non-Jew that he could be kadam and told Hashem. Maybe himself also. When you're buying him, and as you're about to go take him to the mikveh, and he jumps in and he says, "I'm doing it to be a free person." Maybe there also he could be a free person. Who said? We didn't see from the pasuk necessarily that it's automatic. Now, Amar Shmuel says importantly, he says that that when you're immersing him to be this Jewish slave, you have to hold on to him to put him the yoke of work in the water, so that it should be visible that it's a tefillah of avdus. That even if he's going to say, "Oh, I did it to be a free person," he's not going to acquire himself as a free person, and there won't be any substance in his words because as he's toiveling, you're treating him like a slave. So obviously, you cannot say that tefillah was for the purposes of being a free person. As the Gemara brings the story, Kihai de Minimin, who was Avdi de Ravashi, was the slave of Ravashi. So he wanted to immerse him for the purposes of being like a Jew as a slave. This is what a non-Jew has halacha as a Jew on some level. So he gave him over to Ravina and Rav Acha Bered Rav. We said to them, Chazu, see, it's from you that I'm gonna collect from. Meaning, if he's gonna go and say he did it l'shin ben chayrin, I'm gonna be upset at you because I want him to be a slave. So what do? How they show that the tefillah is going to be for abdus? Ramolei arvisa b'tzavore. So they put a leash on his neck, and arpulei b'tzamtzmolei. So it had a slip knot, and when they wanted to, they were able to tighten the edge of the rope, and they would just pull it, and that tightens it around his neck. And when they don't pull it, so it's a little bit loose, and the water could go around his flesh. So the Gemara explains why they did this. Arpulei, they did it loose. It shouldn't be chatzitza, that the mikvah water has to come around his neck. But at the same time, sometimes they would pull it tight. And they shouldn't jump and say, "Oh, I did it to be a free person." It says you can't be a free person because we're treating you like a slave. And when he was picking up his head from the water, so they put on him a vessel full with clay, adesha on his head. They said to him, go bring it to the house of your master. In other words, they treat him, they didn't give him a moment to be like a free person. They treat him like a slave all throughout the tefillah. Later discussion, only a popular rabbi says, Chazimar, let the master see, Hani de Bei Papa Bar Abba. Those from the household of Papa Bar Abba, the Yavi Zuzi Le'inshi Lechargai. What they do is, they give people money for their taxes, and then they have a lien on them. Meaning, when they can't afford to pay the taxes of the government, so the tax collectors grab a hold of those people. Now, the family of Bey Papa, they were very wealthy. What they would do is they would pay the taxes to the government, and they would then acquire those people, those citizens, as servants, and those were non-Jews who were being acquired by this family. Now, the question he was asking was, if that's considered a kinyan as an acquisition, that kinafki, when they are being removed from them, so do they actually need to get a freedom or not? Meaning this, that they own them for this time period, and then they release them when that's over. Do they actually acquire those like slaves mamish, that they need to have I could get shiur or not? Which Shais explains that the subject is that do we say it's like din the machus dino or not? And even though he doesn't acquire his body here, he would, or maybe that no, it's only for the ma'aseh yadayim, and therefore he wouldn't need to get shiur. So mamish, how weit does it go when the government takes these people and they throw them in jail and they hold on to them because they can't pay the taxes and they're paying it for them? So we have your rights on you. How far does it go? Is it going to require get shiur or not?
What about loidu?
What about it? Oh, mean about freeing them?
Yes.
Right. Well, the question is that a full? Or did they didn't have the rights for them for all that time?
If you give him a get shiur, you're doing something.
Right. But they only had like a limited rights on
Why
them
do you need to get shiur?
because you have to free him.
So
Right.
that means it's in your hand. Just don't do it.
Right. That's a good shayla. What happens if you buy a non-Jewish slave for a period of 5 years? You buy him for 5 years. What happens
So
then?
maybe you don't need to get shiur, but if you
When
do,
do you get shiur?
I don't know. Maybe you don't. But if you do, then you do something to over a lot.
Right. Is that is that considered allowed? Right. It's a good question. So says the Gemara, Amalei said to him, you asked very good. Says, if I would have passed away, I wouldn't have told you this thing. Shesha said, Marikayu Dahani, the seal of these people, is in the chest of the king, meaning they're really slaves to him. The king says, whoever doesn't pay the taxes, is indebted to the one who pays the taxes. So therefore, like Rashi explains, it's considered sold to the Beit Papa, and the slaves, so to speak, would need to get shiur if they're going to be Megayer and to permit them to Abbas Yisrael. So anyway, that's the truth, right? Anyways, when you wouldn't do the get shiur, it's really, what's the problem on them tabloid? Because really you're freeing them and they're becoming Jewish people, because once they become free, they become as Megoyer.
And they are not.
Well, no, they are. That's what Rashi says. So why is the taka violation? I guess that would be if you're not giving get shiur. Yeah, you have to know. But then we have the Gemara and Brachas. Yeah, you have to know when you're over. Why you're over if they become Yidden when they're Megai, when they become Meshucher. But either way, that's what the Gemara comes out, that you would have to have a get shiur because you actually own them because the government owns them, and if you pay, you own them now. Now the Gemara brings a story regarding Geirus, regarding conversion. He went to Gabla. He saw the Jewish women who were pregnant from converts who circumcised and didn't immerse themselves. And that's one thing he saw. And he also saw Chamra di Yisrael, there was Jewish wine, the Mazgi of the Kachavim, the Shasi Yisrael, that the non-Jew was pouring and the Jew was drinking. And the third thing he saw in this place, Gavla, is that Tumas in the Sholke of the Kachavim Machli Yisrael, he saw there was this lupine bean that the non-Jews were cooking and the Jews were eating. Regarding these three things, he didn't say anything. Now, Aslik Hamid Rabbi Yechon, he came from Rabbi Yechon, he told him what he saw. Well, he said to him, on all three things, they're all problems. He said, I want you to announce regarding their sons that they're mamzerim, meaning from the fathers were gerim that did a milah but didn't do a tvila. So say that their children are mamzerim. And that their wine is yain nesach, this that was poured by the non-Jews. And while Termas and regarding this lupine being that it's a problem about bishul akum that was cooked by a non-Jew, that because since the people in Gavla are not people that are learned, which Rashi explains, that's going on the turmas being. That because really there's no bishul akum, as the Gemara is going to explain later on, it's because they're not b'nei Torah, so go make it forbidden so that they should not be disgraceful regarding the halacha bishul akum, because if you let them eat the lupine being, they're going to think, oh yeah, you can eat from a non-Jew, it's okay. The rabbis didn't say anything, and they're not going to realize that that is because it's different over there. But regarding all the other things, the Gemara explains, why should you say that the children are illegitimate? Yechon goes according to his reason. It says, and this is why Yechon he himself spoke up, because he holds this. A person is not a ger until there's circumcision and immersion in the mikvah. But even though since he didn't temple, he's not Jewish. And again, a third in a trilogy of his opinion says which we had this as a machlekes. As it's called according to his opinion, holds a non-Jew or a slave that has a relation with a Jewish woman, have vlad mamzer, the child's a mamzer. Again, Chibur Abba could have held like those who hold that the vlad is kosher. But Rabbi Yechon held that A, he's not a yid because he didn't have mila and tvila, and B, Rabbi Yechon held that the Evi Gechavim at Tzvah Bas Yisrael, the vlad's mamzer. Now, Yin Mishum Yain Nesach, and why did he say that the wine is Yain Nesach, wine libations of Avodah Zarah, idolatry, which is forbidden to have anah? Is because even though they didn't touch the wine, rather they were just pouring it. It was from their forest. But that's Mishum Leich Leich Amrin and Nazir, that we tell the Nazir to go all the way around, schar, go around the Carmel Sikh, don't come near the vineyard. So here also, although it's not really Yain Nesach, but the fact that the non-Jews were pouring the wine, he said that should be forbidden to him. And when we said that the lupine being that he said tell them it's forbidden because of Bishul Akum, if he's b'nei Torah, because they're not b'nei Torah, says Gemara, wait, how b'nei Torah? But if they were b'nei Torah, then sure it would be permitted for them to eat the lupine bean. Anything that's eaten raw, there's not a problem about being cooked by non-Jew. Now about Thomas, but the lupine bean it's not eaten raw. So they should have Allah of Bishul Akum. So what does that have to do with any b'nei Torah? So B'Yechon says the Gemara, B'Yechon Ki'idach Lishmas really. He holds like the other version of Rav. Then Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak the Rav, Kol Shein Oila Shulchan Malachim, whatever is not eaten on a table of royalty, Lechel Bayas Apas to eat with it bread, Eimah Mishum B'Shul Av Gechavim does not have the halacha of Bishul Akum, and the Trumas bean is not Chashiv, it's not Oila Shulchan Malachim. And that's why the time of the reason why he said it should be forbidden is only because the aim of the Torah, he's not going to realize the difference. B'nei Torah, sure, but if the B'nei Torah would be permitted, then that's actually how we rule. Like both of them has to be something that's eaten only cooked, and something that's oila shulchan malachim. But if something that's not chashiv, like the lupine bean, that would not have a problem, and therefore it's only because they're not B'nei Torah. Now, continue with this order about gerus, about conversion. Turn about learn the Bryce. Ger shemal b'lei tavel. Regarding a ger that's circumcised but did not immerse himself in the mikvah. But Rabbi Shloimy says, he is a ger. Shekim b'tzin b'avos saying we find by our fathers, shemalu, when did they circumcise themselves? That's when we say avosenu, we don't mean Avram Yitzchak, we mean in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, when they left Mitzrayim. These times also another reference to Pesach, that they circumcised, v'lei tablu, and they didn't table themselves in any mikvah, and yet they removed themselves from the status of being b'nei noach to Mikal the Torah and Mikal b'nei Shechina. So you see that doing circumcision without tefillah is enough. Now, tablu mo. Let's say they immersed themselves in the mikvah, but they didn't do circumcision. So Rabbi Shloimy, he says, how is a ger? That's going to also be considered as a ger. Shekein mitzin, or not also, but he's saying how is a ger? That would be considered as a ger. Shekein mitzin to be mahais, because we find by when we say the mahais, our mothers, we mean the women that left Mitzrayim. Shetavlu, that they immersed themselves, as he was going to explain later on, that they didn't immerse themselves in any water. So with what did they come under the wings of the Shechina? Obviously, the women that immersed themselves, maybe they went to the Yamsuf, but either way, they taivled, and they didn't circumcise, obviously. Now, the Chacham say, no. If someone taivles and doesn't do circumcision, or mobile tavel, or he circumcises, let's say somewhere in Ukraine, and they could have there's a mile there, but the tavel is nowhere to tavel, there's no water anywhere. Ain't ger, you're not a ger, until you're circumcised and you tavel. So we had three different opinions. We had Rabbi Elazar that said it's enough to be mal and not tavel. Rabbi Shua says enough to be tavel, not mal. And the Chacham said no, you have to have tefillah and mila. So the Gemara says Rabbi Shua nami nelef me'avis. Why does Rabbi Shua say that there's enough to do tefillah without mila, but it doesn't say mila without tefillah? Why not learn from those who left Mitzrayim that they had mila and no tefillah? And so the Rabbi Elazar nami nelef me'avis. Why doesn't he learn from the mahis to say that you don't need to have mila where they didn't have mila? And if you're going to say according to Rabbi Elazar, no, ain't done an efshe m'shiyavshe. You can't learn out something that's possible for something that's not possible. Meaning, obviously, the women couldn't do a bris milah, anatomically speaking. But if you're going to say that, but Tanya Litton of Bryce, Rabbi Elazar, he says, I'll prove to you that it doesn't say that svara of ain't done an efshe m'shiyavshe. You can't learn out a male Jew from women who you see them become Jewish by just tefillah, not milah. So you could say that by a man too. What I mean, a man could have a milah, a woman cannot have a milah. So maybe you'll say that's what he doesn't learn from the women. It's not true, because look at the next teaching. Rabbi Elazar himself says, Menayla Pesach Daris, how do we know regarding the Pesach of future generations, not the one that was in Mitzrayim, Shein Ba'al Melachulin, that the Korban Pesach has to be from unconsecrated funds? Where do we know this from? Because now Pesach Mitzrayim says Pesach in Egypt. Then Pesach B'Daris says Pesach in future generations. Ma Pesach Mitzrayim, just the Korban Pesach in Egypt, Ein Ba'al Melachulin, was obviously only from unconsecrated funds because, as Rashi explains, it couldn't have been from Ma'aser Sheni funds because there was no Ma'aser Sheni because they weren't there to Israel yet. They never had the halacha Ma'aser Sheni yet. Pesach Amaladair, so too Pesach in all future generations in Ba'al Melachulin is only from unconsecrated funds. Which only Rabbi Kiva says to Rebbe Laza, you think you learn out something that's possible, something that's not possible from Pesach Mitzrayim? This that didn't come from Ma'aser is because it was not possible, because there was no Ma'aser. But one thing you see is that Amalei, Rebbe Laza says to him, even though it's not possible, but it's still a big proof, we could learn out from that. So you see that he does learn out Efsher Mishi'i Efsher. So if that's the case, so then you should not require even Mila to become a ger, because you could learn out a male who's possible from a woman who's not possible to do Mila. So El Rada says the Gemara, if you take them in base, you're right. But if there was Tvila and no Mila, no one's going to disagree to Mahani that it would be effective to become a Jew, because if we learn out from the women, even Rebbe Lazar holds that done in Efsher Mishi Efsher, so you would learn out from the women that they become Jewish even without Mila. Ki plegi, the machlekes is b'mal b'lei tafel. When there's circumcision without immersion, that's where they disagree. But Eliezer yelled of me office. He learns it out from the men, which the men did Mila and no Tvila. So you see that obviously you don't need it. Rabbi Shua says no, but obviously not Tvila happen. No, the men also had Tvila when they left Mitzrayim. Okay, maybe they jumped in the Yamsuf and they had Tvila. Now, Manola, he says, how do you know that they had Tvila? He says, I'll prove it to you. I mean, the first thing Gemara says, Ilim, there's everything is from the Pasuk in Shemais that says, Leich la'am, v'kidashtu ma'yim ha'macher, Shem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, before Shavuos, before Matan Torah, says, go to the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow. Chipsus, a place they should wash their clothes. Now, if we find the place she'ain toin kibbutz, which does not require the laundering of the clothing. For example, let's say regular balkari, meaning washing the clothing in halacha, in biblical law, is always considered a stringency in purification process. So let's say someone like just had a seminal discharge, he doesn't require to wash the clothing. Yet toin tefillah, he has to table himself, like it says in the pasuk in Bikrat as well. But he should wash himself and he's done until the evening. It doesn't say to wash his clothing. So, Malkim should join kibbutz in a place where you have to launder your clothing. For example, like by Kabbalah Satera, it says that they have to wash their clothing. And it didn't join tefillah. Isn't it a Kabbalah Chayim that for sure they have to table themselves? So you see, that they must table themselves? Says but how do you know that? But Dilma, but maybe that laundering by Matan Torah was not because of Tumah. To tell me that would make a Kabbalah Chayim that you have to go ahead and table yourself. Rather, that was Nikis Balma. That was just to be clean. That their clothing should be white and appropriate to receive the shechina. You have to be well dressed. I mean, that's why they laundered, not because of tachal purposes. So that's not a raya that they did a tefillah. Still, Mahalach said the Gemara, if the raya is from a pasuk in Shemais. So Yikach Moshe Rabbeinu took the blood, and he sprayed it on the people. That's what's called hazah. It's a spray. Now, B'Gemir, we have a tradition that the ein hazah b'lei tefillah. There's no being sprayed with purifying bloods without an immersion. So if they had hazah from Moshe Rabbeinu, it must have been that they had a tefillah. And therefore, Rabbi Shua disagrees and says, no, you cannot just have a milah without a tefillah. They had a tefillah. Now, it says the Gemara Rabbi Shua, tefillah b'mois minol. How does he know that the women had tefillah, that at least tefillah without milah is enough? Machlek is regarding milah without tefillah, but tefillah without milah, everyone agrees is enough. How do you know that? So, logic. Because if that would be the case that they didn't even have tefillah, what would make a woman a Jewess if she doesn't have milah and she wouldn't have tefillah? Obviously, you have to have tefillah. Now, halachically, the Gemara comes out. It says, in a ger, a person cannot be a convert until they have the bris milah and until they have a tefillah. Says the Gemara pshita. Of course, that's the halacha. Yochad v'rabim. We had an individual opinion of Yibishu and Yibir Lezer, and we had that of the Rabbim of the Chacham who said you need both. Halacha gerabim. The halacha is like the Rabbim, like the Chacham. So what's the Shaila? Says Gemara, no, Man Chacham, actually, who's the Chacham? It's not the Rabbim. It's Rabbi Yesi, was an individual Tana. And that's who was saying the halacha is like. It's not like learn the Brayso. If someone comes along and he says, Malti, I circumcised myself, but I didn't table. Halacha is matpilan oisai. They put him into the mikvah, and he becomes like a full-fledged Jew. And we don't have to investigate with witnesses if when he did the bris milah was for the purposes of mitzvah milah or not. And he says umabakach. And what's the difference? If his milah would not be for the purposes of the mitzvah milah, because once he tavels with tevilah itself, it's enough. That's Rabbi Yehuda. That's what Rabbi Yehuda holds. As we quote, he's from that who holds mol v'lei tavel v'lei mol, like Yeshua said, is enough. Rabbi Yisem, he says ein makbilim. No, you cannot tavel him because he might be an Arab who they circumcise themselves, or Gevadim who circumcise themselves, and that's not considered a valid circumcision. And you would have to go out and do hatafas down bris. You have to drop a little droplets of blood of the covenant, because Rabbi Yossi requires both milah and tzvila. So therefore, you can't just go ahead and toivel him, because it's not enough. You have to do milah also. And the fact that he's gemalit, that doesn't mean that's not a bris milah. Bris milah is when you do it l'shem mitzvah milah. So he says, no, you can't just toivel him. Now, Lafika actually, therefore, since according to Yehuda, it's enough with one, so we have the following ramification of this machlekes. Matvilin ger. So you could table a ger who circumcised yesterday on Friday, the Shabbos on Shabbos. Why? Because the truth is, according to Yehuda, with Mila it was sufficient. When you're tabling on Shabbos, you're not really fixing anything or anyone, so it's not ticking mana, it's not fixing anyone. That's the Rabbi Yehuda, because again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, we said anyone is good enough. So the Mila you did already made him Jewish. Whereas Rabbi Yisrael says, no, you cannot toivel him on Shabbos because you also need both. And by just doing the meal on Friday, you still need to have the tefillah. And as we know, the tefillah is not supposed to be done on Shabbos because it's mesakin, and not supposed to be mesakin, it's makav and patish. Therefore, you cannot toivel the ger on Shabbos. Amamar, the master said, we go back just to explain what we just mentioned, that according to Yehuda, he said, Lafikir liver matbiling ger b'Shabbos. You could toivel the ger on Shabbos, and that was like the Bachaz and the words of Rabbi Yehuda. Says the Gemara Pshita, obvious. That obviously it's an automatic outcome of what we just said a line before that. Since according to Yehuda, with one of them it's enough. So if he circumcised himself in front of us on Erev Shabbos, obviously we could table him on Shabbos because we said it. He was already Jewish with the Milah. So my lefika. Of course, I got in the free. If I had the mikveh, if I had the Avon and Shabbos in the free, I got in the mikveh with the what? He's a regular Jew. What's lafika? Says Gemara, no. What would you say? Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yehuda, actually tevila ikar. You would say that actually the primary is the immersion in the mikveh, because on the milah that we heard him say umabakach, which obviously that he's saying that the tevila would be the primary thing. Tefillah b'Shabbos lo, and you cannot table on Shabbos because then you're fixing a person. That's what we're telling you. Rabbi Yehuda oiha, meaning when he said that the person is he came gemalit, and we don't know if he circumcised him. He might have been an Arab. So I said, fine, no problem, table him, and that will make him a Jew. So we didn't necessarily know that one is enough. We might have thought to say that the one is the tefillah and not the milah. And therefore, we would have thought, no, you cannot table him on Shabbos, because that might be what makes him a Jew. That's why saying, no, either one is okay. So either, if he came gemalit, then on the regular weekday we could just table him because that will make him a Jew, and we don't need to have both to do it l'shem geiris. Or if we maled him on Friday, then we could table him on Shabbos because that's what we already made him a Jew on Friday, not with the tefillah. That's why saying either one is okay. Now, similarly, we said over there in the Bryce, Rabbi Yisrael, he says, imakpil. He says, no, you cannot table him on Shabbos because, like we said, he needs both. And even though we circumcised him on Friday afternoon, we ran out of time and the mikvah was already locked. We wanted it to be a yid as fast as possible. We want to do him on Shabbos. No, that's going to be masakin him. Says Rabbi Yisrael, you cannot table him. Says Rabbi Pshita, obviously. That's the same question. The kiyum number Rabbi Yisrael tried to be in the sense Rabbi Yisrael says you need to do both. Of course, you couldn't get Shabbos. You can't fix a person on Shabbos. So what's the chiddush? What would you say Rabbi Yisrael actually mileka? Same type of an answer. We would have thought to say, according to Rabbi Yisrael, the primary is circumcision. And Vahasam over there, where we didn't see him circumcised in front of ourselves. So therefore we said you can't just taivel him and make him Jewish, because you still have to do hatavas down bris. But what we mean to say is that the primary is bris milah. But let's say we circumcise him on Friday afternoon. Even they tell the Shabbat, I would have thought say you could tell him on Shabbos because the primary is actually the Mila, which we did already. Again, the same type of idea. No, Rabbi Yisi needs both. Just like we answered for Rabbi Huda, he needs any one of them, not just that of the Tefillah. So the way we're saying in Rabbi Yisi, no, you need to have both the Mila and the Tefillah. Therefore, you cannot take them on Shabbos because that's going to be Misaka and the Gab. The Gemara ends over the story. Amar Rabbi, Rabbi says, Uvda havda be'Reb Chia, either the gear says Bar Rebbe or Ber Rebbe. Either way, that there was a story with Reb Chia Bar Rebbe. Now, Rav Yisrael, he actually learns that Rabbi Yisrael Bar Rebbe, which, as Rashi explains, that what he's saying is Rabbi Yisrael also was with Reb Chia, and Rav Safra he teaches Rabbi Yisrael Reb Chia, which he's teaching that also Rabbi Yisrael Reb Chia was with them. So essentially, according to the last version of Rav Safra, there was 3 Talmidei Chacham over there. Now, the Asla Kamei Ger Shamal Loy Tamal. So a ger that had circumcised himself but didn't title came in front of him. Amalei said to him, Shehei Kan, says, okay, wait over here, meaning it was nighttime. Wait out the Macha till tomorrow, and then Tvalinach, and then we're going to table you, and then you're going to become Jewish. Says the Gemara, Shmamin Lo Tlas. We learned 3 things from this story. Shmamin, we learned from this, from Rav Safra, that said that there was 3 people. He was the last version. One says it was 1, one says it was 2, and one says it was 3. From his version, we learn out that Ger Tzarech Shleisha, that to become a convert, you need to have a bezdin of 3 people. That's why he says there was 3. Shmamin, we also learn the second thing, that in a ger, you're not a convert until you circumcise and you tell, because they're saying wait till tomorrow. What do you wait till tomorrow? It's already a ger with the milah. No, obviously you need the tefillah too. And Shmamin, we can infer from that. The third thing, emat bilin ger balayla. You cannot immerse a ger at nighttime. That's why they said wait till tomorrow. Says the Gemara, why don't you say you learn that a 4th thing, the beina mumchin, that you need to have a big Talmidei Chachamim, like these 3 were famous were big Talmudic scholars. Maybe that's you could prove that you need not just a regular bezin but also a professional. So no, maybe that's just how the story happened to be. That happened to be these great rabbis. But maybe when you have any 3, that most definitely from the factor of Safra, he adds on. That's telling us you need to have 3. But the fact that you wouldn't necessarily say that they have to be mumchim. Similarly, the Gemara continues related that Amar B'chi Rabba Amar B'ichin says Ger Tzarech Gimel. A ger needs to have 3 rabbis, 3 people, because Mishpat Ksivbe, it says in the pasuk of Midbar Tezvav, Mishpat Echad Yilachem B'Lay Ger. There should be 1 Mishpat for you and for the ger, which Mishpat, obviously a court case, is not less than 3. And saying that with the word of ger tells us that a ger needs to have 3 people to become a ger. Thank you to any time.